anyone in the audience has regarding the microbiology as it relates to reducing sodium content of food. Yes.
Just Preeta Ahuja. I work for USDA, and I'm the lead scientist for the Monitoring Sodium in the Food Supply Project, working with CDC and FDA. I just have this comment more than, and I really would like the panel members to, can you hear me? It's like I have that.
It echoes. Perhaps the other microphone would work better.
Well, I won't introduce myself again, but my comment is that, and I know Dr. Graves talked about a little bit about the variability, and I wish others can address this, because we do, I think we all agree that we need sodium salt for taste, and we need salt for its functional and microbiological properties. But I would like the panel members to address the fact that there is such a high variability in sodium in similar products. For example, when we've done nationwide sampling and followed by lab analysis, we've seen, for example, in bologna, this is for high-selling products like popular brands. The differences range from between the minimum and the highest levels is up almost 2.5 times. So it ranges, I think, from like 750 to 2,000 milligrams per 100 grams. And these are all popular products, high-selling brands. So if you could please address that.
No, I'll just comment again. What I was trying to convey, that what we're trying to do is better measure sodium during the process so that you get better process control. Right now, you don't have real-time ability to do that. So
no, I understand that. And I was complimenting the fact that you addressed that factor about variability, because I did not hear about that in the rest of the discussions or speeches.
Well, I might comment on that. Since you mentioned bologna, there are, of course, a number of different types of bologna products on the market. And so there's 70% poultry bologna, there's 100% beef as the meat, there's pork and beef. And so that's one way they vary, but there's also...
Similar products I'm talking about. So it's all like beef bologna I'm talking about.
Oh.
So, I mean, there is such a high variability. And this is not like only specific to bologna, it's just for a lot of products that we see there's a high variability. I think Casey had shown an example of Italian sausage in her slides. So, I mean, that brings me to the question that it can be done, right? If there is a will to be done.
So I can maybe respond to that a little bit and kind of follow up with Peter's comments. So there could be some reason for that, and I don't know the background of those products, but it could be a regional preference. So different parts of the country may have a specific preference for a flavor profile, and some of that flavor profile may be dictated by the salt content. There could be a safety element. So certain companies may use salt as a component in their food safety validation or predictive modeling. Could be related to the least cost formulation of a product. So although there are a variety of different formulations for a given product, if there are even the same, let's say we're visiting about an all beef bologna or an all beef smoked sausage, there's different cuts that can be used for that, which then can need or require different functionality help to make the available
And I
products.
totally agree with what you're saying, because I mean that kind of shows that when when you bring innovation in, these things, the public health, these issues can be taken care of, and I totally agree with that.
Thank you. Did you have a comment?
I was just going to say, you had mentioned earlier some of the differences with the sodium phosphate, as far as synergies with kind of sodium chloride. So some of these differences could be related to some, oh, I'm sorry, I got to speak into the mic still. I remember listening to Jeff earlier. He had mentioned sodium phosphate has a synergistic effect with sodium chloride. And I was wondering if some of these differences could be explained just through, different groups using kind of different kind of, adjuvants to kind of improve the functionality of the sodium. So it sounds like we're getting close.
All right. Another question?
It seems fairly certain now that there is no slam dunk replacement for sodium, right? And I think we've been here before with fat and with sugar, and with wheat. So in the case of sodium, you're talking about phosphates, nitrates, sorbates, acetates. Can you see the food babe having a heyday with what we are coming up with this cocktail? And the reason I bring this up is, I think you mentioned the millennials who are sort of a little queasy about this. And even if you take dried vinegar, vinegar is not vinegar is not vinegar. So what this, I think, emphasizes is a need for a greater, perhaps, education in terms of giving consumers and customers for manufacturers an option, educating them so that they can make an educated guess. Because after all, eating is a very dangerous game, right? Anytime you put something in your mouth, something is getting hurt. If it's not you, it's what you're eating. Huh? So I think it's very important to be able to educate them, but also to approach this particular exercise with the clean label, but more importantly, a clear label perspective. So if every resolution or solution is explained with the idea of transparency and clarity, perhaps we'll get more of more trust from consumers, and our exercise will go forward with with better results. Thank you. I'll make it fit.
Thank you. Well, I might pose a question of the panel. We heard a lot about the challenges, and no question, depending on what the type of food is, there's usually unique challenges associated with that. I was intrigued by the dough, the refrigerated dough, and the complications that can develop there, and how important sodium can be. But let's think about some of the potential solutions. For example, in the meat. Any thoughts about what might work in lieu of sodium, and in particular from the microbiology standpoint, and if you really want to challenge a clean label? Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, okay, well, I mentioned briefly high-pressure processing. So 600 megapascals, 2 to 3 minutes, is used prevalently to inactivate Listeria monocytogenes by about 2 to 4 logs in these types of ready-to-eat meat products. So that's certainly something that doesn't contribute any sodium to the label, or any other ingredient for that matter. However, it is very expensive relative to a formulated ingredient such as sodium lactate, potassium lactate. There's if you don't own your own system as a processor, which those systems themselves are about $1 million investment, then you're talking about maybe 45, 50 cents of that you're giving up in terms of margin on that product. So there's often a lot of resistance to that for that reason. It's a low margin product to begin with, and it's hard to do that without some, trade-off in terms of the price of the product. But certainly that one's used. Topical antimicrobials that are approved as processing aids, such as octanoic acid, lauric arginate, they're prevalently used in the industry to kill Listeria. But you mentioned, Dr. Doyle, you asked me the question about spoilage, and I believe that those don't necessarily address the spoilage issue quite well.
Regarding HPP, I've heard many individuals suggest this could be our panacea that's going to fix many different problems. But I've also heard companies have applied it at levels that would kill perhaps 4 to 5 logs of salmonella, and they get off odors and off flavors. Poultry as an example. What do you think about that, Peter?
I've not run across that myself, but that's a very interesting unintended consequence. The other that I often think about is what other pressure-resistant organisms are we leaving in that product that we don't know what sort of situation we could be creating from a safety standpoint.
Well, with the big movement now to dried vinegar, I mean, many companies are now applying this. Do you think we're going to have resistant organisms developing?
I sure hope not.
Okay.
One thing about the high pressure, I think those are great for consumer-sized packages that might be sitting out there, but if you're talking about delis where they're going to be slicing it there, once you open that up, you've lost that protection. And so then when that goes into individual packages and the consumer takes it home to the refrigerator, which is at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, then you've lost all of that protection. So it's a good during your distribution and storage, but not necessarily going to give you any protection once it gets in the consumer hands. Versus the antimicrobials that are already included in that do have that residual protection.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about, opportunities of what ingredients in the future, technology in the future can be used to help with sodium reduction, we have to dance around that fine line of not losing the functionality of salt itself. So, 1.5% salt addition is about 800 milligrams per 100 gram serving. So that kind of sets us at a stage of, we're on that threshold of functionality, and then it's a matter of how low can we keep that number and still maintain the functionality so that in a processed meats aspect, we still have a hot dog that has a texture of a hot dog and represents a hot dog. And that becomes a great challenge. Are there other ingredients that can facilitate the function of salt, such as phosphates? Absolutely, but that has self-limiting value as well.
So Kathy, Bill, what about dairy products? What are some good options for us to consider there?
Again, we've been doing research in a variety of different areas, and I always rely on my friend to the right here on the use of fermentates or antimicrobials. Certainly, there's research also on similarly with high pressure processing with regard to cheese. So we're kind of working in parallel in each of these areas, trying to identify what is going to help the industry. So we're trying to conduct the research and get the word out to the industry so that they can adopt the learnings.
I think with the natural cheeses, as we pointed out, there's very limited additional antimicrobials that you can add into a natural cheese because there's a standard of identity for a lot of those, and they preclude that. So you're going to be really limited with taking a look at the acidity level and the type of acid that's going to be in there, the protective cultures, which are still at the infancy but have real potential, the clean label or like the fermentates, the cultured dairy products. We've tried that on a couple of things, and they do look like they have some applicability, but I think we're still getting a little pushback from the producers because they're concerned about how that's going to be in a standard identity product. Do they have to label it differently? Are they going to have some residual flavor issues or functionality issues? So once again, it is really limited on that. But what you use for a cheddar is not necessarily what you're going to use for a mozzarella or for queso blanca or for Parmesan. Some of those don't need anything else, and some of them may need something else. So each one of them really there's not really one-stop shopping for all the natural cheeses. And then once again, with the processed cheeses, it depends upon, once again, what is going to be the water activity and the pH of that, what kind of additions we're going to be able to have. I sort of jokingly said, maybe not all jokingly, about some of the nitrite that comes from the cultured celery powder, which is used in meat products. I'd love to be able to use that because nitrate's a great Clostridium inhibitor. Haven't decided whether or not that's one thing that we would like to explore with FDA and find out if they would be interested in allowing us to put it in a non-standard product. But boy, nitrite would be wonderful. And but I think once again, as the consumer really understands what are the contributors of antimicrobial activity from these clean label antimicrobials, they may or may not accept it. So cultured celery looks good. If you said you added sodium nitrate, they'd say, oh no, that's not so good. But it does have functionality and does provide a level of safety. So we're going to have some trade-offs. You can't have everything, unfortunately.
Well, do you see any other natural antimicrobials on the horizon?
Certainly the fermentates are going to be something we need to explore more. So Peter asked about the nisin, and so those cultured dairy products frequently can also come up with bacteriocins, which are basically a nisin type of thing. Some of those, once again, might have, the dry vinegar, acetic acid will have some antimicrobial activity. The lactic acid will have antimicrobial activity. Something that might be inhibitory to Listeria, like the propionate, does not necessarily inhibit the Clostridium botulinum. So we have to do more work on that to define which ones of those organic acids are really the most inhibitory and which ones aren't. So there's a lot of potentials from those fermentates, but once again, they really have to be explored, and you can't use necessarily a surrogate for that, and there's very few labs that can work with Clostridium botulinum. What works with sporogenes may or may not work with Clostridium botulinum. You can screen for it, but then there's nothing other than validation.
How about spices?
If we're using some of the examples, once again, that we're using for Listeria, the concentrations that we need in order to get inhibitory activity sometimes overpower the flavor profile for some of these products and not necessarily a good thing. When I also take a look at some of the processed cheeses that we've had over the year that are the garlic herb, I don't know if they come up with more spoilage spore formers or what, but we have a tendency to see more failures with some of those than we do successes. And spices can come up with, like I said, a lot of their own spore formers, and the levels at which we're going to need to add to be inhibitory may be prohibitive.
So the fermentates, I'm not arguing that's not a good idea, but I'm hearing that consumers, millennial and those generations, like more transparency and wanting to know what's in their food. And for a long time we've been using fermented whey, fermented with Propionibacterium shermanii, and adding that to bread and bakery products as a whey fermentate. And so how long do you think this can go on? I think with time, we're probably going to have to be more transparent what we're adding with fermentates and other types of products.
So are you considering then like titering it for efficacy, titering the fermentate to figure out what's the active species, so from a labeling standpoint, as opposed to this more generic kind of cultured solid, exactly. This is specifically what it is. And also from a food safety standpoint, you certainly want to understand what you're putting in there. And so there's going to be some specification, I would assume, around the efficacy of these materials, that you're using.
I think there's a lot of magic pixie dust that's out there right now, and some of that magic really does work, and trying to identify what it is. I know better. I know that one ingredient company is analyzing what the other ingredient company is doing. They're working out on that, and I do know enough of those ingredient companies that really understand that they have to deliver a certain amount of activity if they're going to be trying to suggest that this is going to be for Listeria control, this is for Clostridium control. They want to make sure that they are going to always deliver something, because if they don't, if they have failures, it's going to come back to bite them. But once again, the transparency, nobody seems to want to go out on the limb and say that in fermentate X, it has this percentage of propionic acid and this percentage of lactic acid. You just sort of have to figure that out yourself, probably.
And bacteriocins.
And bacteriocins, yeah.
Any questions from the audience? points to be made. Yes, Kathy.
I have a question, kind of taking it back to Kathy Woteki's points this morning about public-private partnerships and thinking about this challenge that we have ahead of us in terms of, finding solutions. I was kind of taken with your example in the Dairy Innovation Center, and what you've done is a great example of some public-private partnerships from what you've described. And so in thinking about what Kathy Woteki raised this morning, are there some ways that we could be thinking about this that could take us toward that approach or that direction? Obviously, lots of things to figure out in trying to make that happen, but maybe that would take us in a little different, broader conversation around ways forward. Just a thought.
Again, through the Innovation Center, you're right. I mean, I think that's the right direction. If we can find the collaborative partnerships that you can move something forward, like the food safety curves was frankly 9 industry partners getting together, putting together funding to go do something that is going to be done for the greater good of the industry. How could we build on that as a next step? I mean, is the real question, so we got the process started with that, but then there's still going to be much more research needed. So, maybe by, I'm thinking, that was the start, but Kathy, I know there's more research to be done. How can we work together to try and move that forward with either government grants? What Kathy was talking about this morning is exactly right. Is it, I mean, Edith and I were in the back row talking about the commodity initiative, or NEFA. So we're trying those things, but some of those grants are pretty tough to get. So that's the challenge. It takes an awful lot of work to put it together.
So of all the foods that are out there that have substantial levels of sodium, from the microbiology perspective, which ones do you think are going to be the toughest nut to crack in terms of reducing sodium?
I'll leave that to Kathy.
Well, I might make a comment because I heard 4 times, no less than 4 times this morning, standard of identity, and a couple times this afternoon. So maybe some of those products that are restricting the modification of the formulation because of the standard identity would be the toughest ones until and unless people, like perhaps some in this room, get together and put out what are the recommended modifications to the standards of identity for different products.
Good point.
Such as maybe bacon or dry-cured pork like prosciutto and country ham and things like that. Those are some examples I could think of. Maybe there's some cheese ones as well, I don't know, or dough.
Again, it's the same thing is true, in terms of cheddar cheese. If you add certain ingredients, it takes it out of the standard, and anytime you call it low sodium or low-fat cheese, you can just look at the volume numbers for those particular products, and they're low. So it's a big challenge.
Well, I think as we've all agreed on, there isn't a direct substitute one by one for sodium chloride. And what's going to be probably one of the limitations is going to be the consumer acceptance of what we're using as a substitute. So if they don't like the potassium chloride, there's going to be a limitation. If they don't like the nitrite, there's a limitation. If they don't like the clean label antimicrobials we're trying to give them because it's not transparent enough, there's going to be a limitation. So I don't know if there's any one particular commodity that's going to be, of an issue. I think anything that the consumer's not going to accept what's on the label, but they still would like to have those prepackaged convenience foods, that's going to be a tough thing.
Dave, what do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. Sometimes I like to use this phrase, does a difference make a difference? And so in the food industry, we oftentimes will do kind of formulations and we'll see a difference, and does it make a difference to the consumer? And so there's some hesitancy within industry to kind of change. You know, if you've got a standard of identity that consumers have been used to having year after year after year, and you make a slight change, you know, is that going to come back, you know, at you? And so, in some regards, I think as we employ these new strategies to reduce sodium, we have to be comfortable with the fact that it might be different. The product might, in fact, be different, and there may be kind of a learning curve, or at least some education or explanation as to why these changes are being made, and some buy-in from the consumers as to, you know, being a partnership with us, as opposed to us just kind of maybe just kind of putting it out in the marketplace so they understand where these changes come from.
Jeff, what do you think about meat? What kind of meat products, what might we lose if the government decides to get tough on sodium?
All of it. No, I don't. That's a good question. You know, certainly, like the dry cured products, which have a standard of identity with them, would certainly be impacted, and you know, a lot of the snacking products. So a lot of the higher sodium products, I think we can safely say, are the hot commodity right now. It is where the growth in the meat and poultry industry is. Snack items, snack foods, jerky, snack sticks, grab and go types of things, and that demographic. And I don't have the market data to support this, but I believe that demographic is interested in a salty, high-protein meat snack, and so the saltiness is part of a unwritten standard of identity for that product in terms of consumers.
But you know, if you look at what the progress has had in the last 5 years or so, the meat industry has gone to a lot of, from the sodium lactate, potassium lactate. They've already made progress in reducing sodium compared with back in 2010. Do we need another survey to find out what is what's happening today, and what kind of progress have we had since 2010?
So I'm hearing that standards of identity could be an impediment. Is there interest by the industry in getting the standards of identity changed?
I know that there's always interest in getting standards of identity changed. It's a very arduous process. I know that you know, a lot of people are taking products out of standard, is what different large companies have done as a workaround.
Okay. Well, we have time for one last question. Anyone? All right. Well, then I'm going to invite my let's give these folks a hand. They do a perfect job.